Chest 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so go ahead and put that in your favorite pocket. Okay, close it up. Get your tie. And just keep in mind we're recording, so project a little more than you normally
Okay.
would.
All right.
But you're on.
I'm on? Yeah, I can hear me. Okay, we're all set. Yeah.
A little bit after 6.
Okay.
They're waiting. They said there are a few more people coming.
Okay.
But they're
Well,
on
the
webcast.
rain is here too, so.
Oh,
So you got to give people a little more time because, you know,
are
they,
you spending? What are you doing? Are you spending tonight and then going
If I want
back?
to turn it off
Yeah,
for
tomorrow
now,
morning.
do that. Is that possible?
No, I'm glad to do it. I'm glad I met him.
I don't know.
Any new computer development since we last spoke?
So I prefer you leave it on the
No, I think,
Things are about steady.
yeah, I heard that John's going to take the month of August off. That's the only thing I heard.
Can it go
For the new guy.
in any pocket?
I think he doesn't want to lose his vacation, but I don't
Think
know.
so?
I'll be right
How's
back.
that?
Is a men's room down here?
Exactly. Before we part tonight, I want to share one thought.
Oh, okay. Hi, all right, good to see you again. Yeah, trying. Yeah, I can't say anything, it's ridiculous. All right.
Now remember,
Young man,
you say
where's
now,
the men's room?
So just out this door to the right.
Okay.
picking this up.
How you doing?
Good. How are you, Jakob? We just had that conversation. No, not for the moment. No. So for full, you were saying that you can get associate? Yeah. Letters? Doesn't have to be full?
It's unclear, but I'm coming up.
Just go for it.
They changed the rule of coming up for associate.
Okay. All right. Well, in all fairness, they should, if they're saying associate, then they should allow associates to write the letters.
Nothing to do.
Which only makes sense for 10. I mean, if they're looking for 10 letters, well,
That's a lot of letters.
yeah, 10 is ridiculous. I mean, I think we're asked for 6. 10 is crazy. And 10 full would be, I mean, that's just almost impossible. Like, there aren't even 10, nationwide.
To get 10 letters, you have to ask about 20.
Yeah. How was Poland?
You missed it.
Yeah, no, I would have liked to go. This is my 13th talk. And I've got a few more, so.
How's the book doing?
It's good. It's good, yeah. But just a lot of talk, so that's.
Buy a new car?
No, it's not like that, but it got us some good review. Financial Times, National Review, European Politics. Peter Berkowitz was there.
Who did the Times?
Edward Luce. He paired it up with Ian Bremmer's new book.
How was it?
It was good. It was a good review. Actually, it's funny because when I saw Bremmer's book, I thought, that would be a natural pairing. I wonder if anybody would do that. Loyola, Mario Loyola. Yeah. Really, what he did was just describe the content of the book, which is
Good to see you. Oh, hi, Lee. Yeah, of course. How are you?
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Maybe a quarter of a century.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe. Close. How have you been?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah, I hear your name or see your name from time to time. You're staying busy.
Still over at Heritage.
Yeah.
he read. It was just.
Oh, you want to turn it on? Oh, okay.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
You're the author?
Yes, Colin Duick.
Ross Johnson, yeah,
Hi.
over visiting
Oh,
fellow
great.
and
Hi again.
fellow at the Wilson Center.
Oh, great. Nice to meet you. You too?
Yeah, look forward to your
Yeah. Me too.
presentation and your book, which I haven't looked at yet. Yeah, great.
This is wonderful. We could turn that off for now.
We were just. Yeah, I was asking, but
In here?
let's see. I had that exact question myself, but he said, let's leave it on.
Yeah, cool. they need to turn me on. Huh?
You're going to be in town for a while.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, it sounds okay.
Okay, here,
All
that's
right.
you.
All right, thank you. Where's our host?
Okay.
There's a mic floating away a little bit. But you're on the far left, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So when you turn that way, you'll get the
Okay.
comments. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Sorry. I hate to give up my drinks, but
No, I just...
Thank you. I won't do it again.
You see, I really read.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Hoover in Washington, the new office of the Hoover Institution here in Washington, D.C. My name is Mike Frank, and I'm the new director of the office here, as well as a research fellow at Hoover. This is an example of more and more what we'll be doing here. Book events, policy discussions. We'll be doing a lot of roundtables. The place will be hopefully buzzing or humming with activity in the months and years ahead. And we're hoping to have a more regular flow of senior Hoover experts and scholars to come through and share with us what they're doing. And tonight we're doing something that's hopefully going to be a very normal type of event here, a book event on a very important new book that examines President Obama's foreign policy legacy, the Obama Doctrine, which we'll be talking about. And I want to turn it over right now. I promised I'd limit my remarks to 90 seconds, so hopefully I'm within 90 seconds.
91.
91. Okay, well, again, thank you for coming tonight. And Karen, you're up.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all here to Hoover's new space. And I don't know if have any of you walked around the space and seen how beautiful it is. I don't know if the new director allows tours, but it's a really fantastic opportunity for the Hoover Institution to join the conversation right in Washington. We've always been part of it, but to be here in our own space and to be to not so much compete with, but to hopefully collaborate with other think tanks such as Heritage, where Lee Edwards has had a distinguished career writing about conservatism and documenting the movement, and many others, is a great opportunity. I'd like to also welcome Mike Franks to the new job, and I hope we aren't a little too odd for you at Hoover. We're a different breed because we're located at Stanford, so we really combine a lot of scholarship with public policy, and so welcome to Hoover, D.C., and Hoover in the larger sense. We look forward to your leadership, and it was just wonderful for me that when I suggested that we do this book event, Mike, along with others, moved into action to make this happen, and I think many of you are here because he invited you. Let me just quickly introduce our panel. I don't want to say much about them because I want to jump into the discussion, but Colin is a professor, a tenured professor at George Mason University School of Public Policy, Government, and International Affairs. Is that the newest name of it? It's a merger of schools. He's got a distinguished record of writing about foreign policy and conservative foreign policy with Princeton University Press books, and his new book on the Obama Doctrine with Oxford University Press. He's done a great work in this project and many others. He's written in top political science and international relations journals, and he's written in the popular press as well. Tom Henriksen is a close friend of mine, a senior fellow at Hoover, a distinguished historian of American foreign policy. He has his own book series with Palgrave Macmillan, and he's one of our most distinguished scholars. He just keeps going and writes more and more. I don't think he'll ever stop. If I can write as much, I'll catch up to him on my 102nd birthday. So I'm doing my best. And I'm Kyron Skinner. I'm a Hoover Fellow and a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and I direct the International Relations and Politics program. Our format tonight will be about 20 minutes of remarks by our guest. I'll then probe him with a few questions and a few remarks. Tom will then follow, and we like to make this as conversational as possible. We'll have about, I hope, about 20 or 30 minutes of Q&A. So, Colin, we'd like you to start, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay. So this book, I decided to call it the Obama Doctrine. I noticed when I first started thinking about the book that if you Google the Obama Doctrine, you get an unusual range of options. There's something about this president. There seems to be a lot of debate over what is the Obama Doctrine. Some of the candidates were terms like engagement, leading from behind. Actually, drone strikes was one of the candidates. And the most likely one before I started writing the book, in my mind, was that there really is no grand strategy. There is no Obama Doctrine. Right? And this is a common view, that President Obama doesn't actually have an overarching strategy. And there's some truth to that in the sense that if a strategy is supposed to impose a kind of rigorous coherence between ends and means in specific cases like Syria or Ukraine, you find that the U.S. right now doesn't have a coherent strategy, right, in those cases. On the other hand, if you define the term a little more loosely, I would argue that there is actually an overarching grand strategy in the sense that he has certain assumptions coming in. He's willing to make certain decisions or even not to make decisions. There are inevitable trade-offs, and in that sense, he makes choices another president might not make. There's no getting around those inevitable trade-offs. So in that sense, there is a grand strategy or an Obama doctrine. And in one sentence, the way I define it is to say, overarching American retrenchment and accommodation internationally, in large part to allow the president to focus on securing liberal policy legacies at home. So one of the value addeds of that definition is that it incorporates the domestic political side into foreign policy, which I think is exactly what the president does, and it's not uncommon with other administrations as well. It's not necessarily scandalous. I'm not suggesting he's the first president to do it. What I would say in his case is that foreign policy is not his main interest. That his domestic agenda is actually his primary interest, and this has a profound effect on his foreign policy choices. I think there's a lot of evidence that he's governed with an eye on trying to secure his place historically as what he thinks of one of the country's great liberal or progressive presidents. And so for that reason, he's very reluctant to break or risk his domestic ambitions through international military commitments that might shatter his domestic coalition. He keeps the final decisions in his own hands. It's a very tightly centralized White House on foreign policy, in consultation with an inner circle of White House advisors. And there's a paradox in that it's highly centralized where decisions are often deliberately not made or cans are kicked down the road precisely in order to avoid domestic political risk. This is one of the things we've seen again and again. So these three themes, retrenchment, accommodation, and domestic. Let me go into a little bit of detail about each of them. Retrenchment is an effort to reduce a country's international and military costs and commitments. It doesn't necessarily mean going all the way toward isolationism, but it's a direction. And clearly Obama wanted to go in that direction, or as he called it, end wars, right? This was the term he came up with his speechwriter, Ben Rhodes. And so we've had kind of an interesting test case the last few years, which is a partial strategic retrenchment in terms of U.S. military spending, force posture, security strategy. And in the words of that great grand strategist, Dr. Phil, how's that going for you? How's that working for you? Well, the answer is there have been some unintended consequences. I think consequences that the president never intended, right? He intended a more low-cost, detached approach. But is it working? Well, some of the consequences he did not intend. There's always a trade-off in a strategy between cost and risk. You can look for a smaller cost, for example, by cutting defense in the short term. But the classic studies of grand strategy, authors like John Gaddis, for example, would say, if you lower cost, you raise risk. In other words, your allies might be unnerved. Your adversaries might be emboldened, right? There is a trade-off. This is true of any strategy. Striking thing in Obama's case, there's really no recognition of any trade-off at all. So there's reduced cost in the short term, but very little recognition of increased risk. Basically, current plans assume or maybe hope that international adversaries will not take advantage of America's scaled-back ability to handle a range of possible challenges. Right? The danger, obviously, is that they might misperceive the true extent of American commitment and resolve under the impression the U.S. won't respond, when in fact eventually it will. So there's a real danger of deterrence failure right now in multiple cases. I hope we can talk a little bit about that in Q&A. The other problem, of course, is we've scaled back on capabilities like defense, but actually the commitments have not been scaled back to the same extent. So we have a gap today. There's a gap between capabilities and commitments. It's a classic problem, but it's a gaping gap today. That raises all kinds of problems. So when you look at specific cases, Iraq, for example, it's very clear even from sympathetic accounts. A book like James Mann's Obamians documents that even though the president claimed that negotiations over a U.S. base presence broke down because of the issue of troop immunity, the fact is the White House didn't really want a continuing base presence anyway. And so, for example, James Mann puts it, U.S. military leaders had worried about the impact of a complete withdrawal from Iraq, military leaders. But in political terms, making a clean break was much better for Obama than leaving some American troops in the country. Getting out of Iraq had been the central theme in the campaign that brought him to the White House. Any decision to extend the American troop presence there would be portrayed as a violation of these promises. In other words, Obama actually wanted, on one level, to remove those troops and then campaigned on it the following year as a win. Well, the unintended consequence we've all seen is this is one of the factors that fed into the rise of ISIS. We've seen that to devastating effect the last year or two. So that was retrenchment, right? It doesn't always work out as planned. One of the striking things in Obama's case is there's often been material retrenchment or material non-intervention, even when there's verbal commitment to the opposite. So you take an example like the Asia pivot. Much has been made of the pivot. At the same time, we've seen deep cuts to the Navy. So strategically, those two things do not add up. You can either pivot to Asia or you can cut the Navy. You can't really do both at the same time. So this is incoherent. But it does serve Obama's priority, which is long-term, keep defense down. And of course, Libya was a classic case of a temporary, very light-footed intervention and then de facto disengagement. Libya is now a failed state and a playground for militias, organized crime, and jihadist forces, including ISIS. So the question in everyone's mind today overseas is whether the U.S. will actually support its allies in a crisis situation. The president says that it will, but since these words exist alongside powerful indicators of retrenchment, there is frequent confusion as to whether the United States is coming or going. And the consequent feeling in allied capitals is that America is stepping back from its traditional international role. Now, accommodation is the assumption, unlike just straightforward bargaining, which would be simultaneous mutual concessions. With a strategy of accommodation, you are trying to alter the intentions of a potential opponent, right? So efforts at accommodation might begin with a relatively one-sided concession toward a target state, some kind of costly gesture of goodwill in the hope of triggering a process of mutual restraint and conciliation. It would be like going to the car dealer and saying, I'm going to buy a car I don't really want at a price I don't really like because I want a good relationship with you down the road. Would that be a good way of buying a car? Probably not. But that's a strategy of accommodation. In this, the risk of exploitation is deliberate in order to be convincing. So the president made it very clear from the beginning that he was going to try to accommodate, for example, Russian foreign policy concerns. He wasn't just going to sit down and bargain hard. Even those sympathetic to the administration say that the assumption was we will accommodate Russian concerns on a range of issues in order to trigger a process whereby Russia and the U.S. are more cooperative. Some of the concessions, issues like missile defense, NATO expansion, Moscow's accession into the WTO. Basically, Obama refused to see the need for any kind of intense competition with Moscow for influence in former Soviet republics. And the purpose of this more conciliatory approach was not only to secure Russian cooperation on specific issues, but to kickstart a broader process of cooperation. It was a hopeful strategy of accommodation. Well, what happened, of course, the attempted accommodation did not address Russia's concerns. Apparently, they were more deep-seated than that, because a striking pattern during the Obama era was Putin's persistent assertiveness relative to the United States on one issue after another, right? Efforts to expand a Russian sphere of influence in the near abroad, objection to any missile defense plans whatsoever, occupying portions of Georgia militarily, building up and modernizing the Russian armed forces, and so on. And of course, finally in Ukraine, forcibly dismantling a sovereign state. So we've seen that the attempt at accommodation did not work. So that's an example of where there was an unintended consequence. In the case of Iran, again, President Obama seems to have gone on the assumption that by making relatively one-sided concessions, you might trigger a more cooperative relationship with a friendly Iran down the road. He's actually said as much. A few weeks ago, he said to Tom Friedman in the New York Times, we are powerful enough to be able to test these propositions without putting ourselves at risk. Again, denial of risk. There is no risk. We can sign the deal, right? And that's the thing people don't seem to understand. Who knows? Iran may change. That's the assumption. That is actually the premise. So for all of the sophistication of the presentation, you're talking about the possibility that the U.S. may now accept a nascent Iranian nuclear weapons program, lift international sanctions against Iran, allowing it to continue on its current relatively aggressive foreign policy course in the region. It's a regime that's fundamentally hostile to the United States. And this is in the hope that, who knows, Iran may change. That's accommodation. Again, it's not really working. It's probably not going to work. It has to be said, however, how much time do I have left?
Keep going.
Okay. I'm trying to keep up a breakneck pace here. So the third theme is domestic. Now, I would say internationally, the Obama Doctrine has not worked as intended. Domestically, it has to be said, he has had some success with it, at least the first 4 or 5 years. After all, if a key concern within the White House was to prevent international entanglements from derailing the president's domestic agenda or his reelection, then it must be said, mission accomplished. During his first term, whatever problems there were with his foreign policy, he did give the public much of what it wanted. If you think about the median voter, the voter right in the middle, a staggered withdrawal of American troops from Iraq and Afghanistan, avoidance of major new ground interventions, and of course an end to Osama bin Laden. And the last of these in particular allowed him to run for re-election in 2012 as an incumbent president with a clear political edge on foreign policy issues. A remarkable accomplishment for an incumbent Democratic president. So by any reasonable standard, even though I'm not a fan of his domestic agenda, you have to say there have been dramatic and sweeping changes in a liberal direction on a host of issues, right? Healthcare, financial regulation, the environment, same-sex marriage, and in no case have they been held hostage to diplomatic or military controversies overseas. So in that sense, the Obama Doctrine did achieve its purpose, at least during his first term. What has shifted in his second term, and is interesting, is that starting in 2013, what was once considered a strength is now considered a weakness. His foreign policy approval ratings specifically have gone down. They are now in the low 30s. They are lower than his overall ratings. It is now seen as a particular weakness of his. And what seems to have happened is eventually reality has caught up. There's been a feedback effect, and the public now is able to see that there's a problem. And crises beginning in Syria, 2013, then Ukraine, and now most dramatically ISIS, have led the median voter to conclude that there is something disturbing about President Obama's foreign policy style. It's a little too weak, a little too confused, a little too indecisive for the median American voter. So this is a problem, and it's going to affect the election next year, because even if, for example, the likely Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton, even if she has a reputation as being relatively hawkish, in American political history there's something called retrospective voting, 2 words, and there's no getting away from it, which is to say, if you're running as the nominee of the party who's the incumbent, and that incumbent is unpopular, you can message however you like, but you will be associated with that president. She will be tied, particularly because she was the Secretary of State. Okay, so there's double reason. So she is going to be intimately associated with the failures of his foreign policy. So she may be weaker than expected going into the general election. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, thank you for those comments, and I'll make a few of my own, repeating some of what you said, but posing a few questions that I'd like you to be able to respond to right after Tom talks. First of all, I'd like to try to, in my own words, present your argument. And I think one of the reviewers of your book, and there have been numerous reviews in top magazines and newspapers, states that you say that the Obama grand strategy is a pivot to America, more so than anything else. Transform the U.S., not the world. retrench from international engagement so that Washington's focus can be on recreating some version of the New Deal and the Great Society. This retrenchment is so important to President Obama that he's willing to accommodate adversaries so long as he is able to march forward on his domestic agenda. It also means that this pivot homeward, withdrawing from the two Middle East wars that he inherited, reducing military spending, turning toward Asia, especially in political economy engagements. Peter Berkowitz, one of our scholars here at Hoover, who works in this office, wrote a review of your book and said that you had done something incredibly important as a student of U.S. foreign policy, being one of the first to really articulate the Obama Doctrine in this lengthy form. You also argue, I think, that President Obama's strategy, that he does in fact have an intuitive grand strategy, and you look at many of his writings, your book is deeply steeped in his original words, that he does have an intuitive grand strategy, as I just described, but the international system and America standing abroad is deteriorating because of his strategy. So when I read your book, I thought, perhaps that's true. We've heard that in some form or another. What the value of your work is that you ground it in the president's words, his strategy documents, and it's very carefully researched. But what concerned me a bit is that there's an obvious rival hypothesis to what is going on in the international system, the chaos. And that might be that there are indigenous factors in the countries and regional dynamics that have a lot to do with, and historical processes with why Iran might want a nuclear weapon, the Persian Empire and tradition historically of being a dominant force in the region that have very little to do with who's the occupant in the White House. And so I'm interested in trying to deconflict how much of what we see going on from Ukraine, where there's been a deterioration that you've talked about, to Iran, to Syria, to Yemen, how much of this is really about the United States and how much of it is about other forces. And I think really making the case that your hypothesis is stronger as an explanation than others like this one, I think makes the book more important if you're able to do so. Second, I thought I'd like you to talk about what appropriately Carthaginian solutions to foreign policy actually mean. Does it mean hand-to-hand combat around the world? Does it mean going back into wars? I think that concept got some attention in your reviews, and if you could talk a bit more about that, I think that would be useful. I'd also like to see you talk about this kind of coercive strategy that you endorse against adversaries. Have you thought through the cost to the U.S. taxpayer of the kind of foreign and defense policy that you want? Because again, if you're interested in kind of making the policy case and winning in that debate, Americans are deeply concerned about just how much defense spending is going to cost, and you have a relatively robust strategy outlined in your book. And then you talk about conservative American realism, and I think we'd like to hear a little bit more about what that concept means, and will any of the Republican presidential candidates be willing to buy into this concept of conservative American realism? It sounds to me like what you're really trying to say is what George Kennan said so long time ago, that it's Europe, NATO countries, it's the Middle East, it's Japan, Northeast Asia, that's the kind of security interest for the United States. If that's the case, what's different in your strategy offered in your book versus what Kennan said in the 1940s? I think that I will stop there and turn to Tom.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. on the way walking over here, I was thinking about a lot of things, but before I get into that, I just want to say thank you to Kyron Skinner for organizing this panel, for her efforts to bring us all together, and of course for Colin Dueck's very interesting book, and the staff here as well, the new director Mike Frank for posting it, and his assistant Mark McCullum for helping us all out. With that said, walking over here, maybe it was rain, but I was reminded of a story. Academics can't tell jokes because no one ever laughs, but this is a story anyway. And this takes place in London, 1940, during the Blitz. And you have to picture in your mind, you've seen pictures of this, I'm sure, of the black sky and the searchlights piercing and the bombs coming down in the background. There's St. Paul's almost in flames. In any case, an elderly woman walks up to an air raid warden, dressed in black, and he has one of these soup plate helmets turned upside down, and she says to him, "You know something? These bombs really take your mind off the war." And I think that's a lot what's happened under Obama. But we tend to look at these things happening in Boston with someone with allegedly a terrorist, or there's an incident in Texas and so on. And in some ways, it's a disservice because, as Colin Dueck has brought out in his book, there are really some serious problems in Asia. With China, which is even more aggressive, and you painted it because your book obviously had to stop to have your book published, or with Ukraine, with the Russians, with their probing, with their coming across international borders with flights, and of course the rise of ISIS, which is becoming a real serious problem now for the United States. And it doesn't look, at least in my mind, that it will be eliminated in the next 2 years. And if it lasts 2 years beyond that, you're no longer talking about a sort of a ephemeral phenomenon. You're talking about a future rogue state. And so it's quite a bit different. So I think your book is superb in the idea of critiquing in a very dispassionate, non-polemical, academic, analytical way the Obama policy. And I think that does a service not just to Republicans, but to also those Democrats interested in finding out. You've also done a very good job, I think, of analysis of the 3 strands of conservative thought, the idea that it would be a anti-interventionist policy or strand or school of thought, a internationalist policy, or a nationalist conservative view. These are all very good. I also like the list of advantages that the United States has, that you record roughly 20 advantages the United States has over other large states in the world. And this, I think, should end some of the declinist debate. I, too, have some questions, however. Okay. One of the interesting things is, and I want you do mention this, so it's not, but you don't emphasize it, and that a lot of your perspective is Obama's protecting his legacy, and I don't disagree with that, his economic and political legacy of a sort of New Deal, or as you phrased it, or perhaps a great society. But I also think there's a very strong ideological strand in this man's thinking. If you had a chance to look at today's Washington Post front page, Greg Joffrey's article on the Selma speech. I don't know if you saw it or not. It was fawning. It was explanatory to us and the great unwashed that don't understand these issues. He was explaining the Selma speech, which, as you may recall, was a rebuttal to Giuliani's comment that this president is not, in fact, like other American presidents. The ideas that he expresses are not new. These have been going around in the academic world, history departments, political science departments, humanities departments, since the 1960s. If you walk on any any university campus, and lots of our high schools, the idea that America is in fact a racist society, that America is in fact a society that beats up on people, but has no redemptive qualities at all, and so on and so forth. This is the sort of thing. The speech that Obama gave in Selma was to explain his version of exceptionalism, which is a highly critical, and America should admit all its faults. None of that is new. But what is new is that our chief executive does elevate and amplify those kind of thoughts. I mean, they're said by lots and lots of professors. We don't need our chief commander-in-chief to say those things. We've all heard them from, if you've gone through school at any time in the last 50 years, you've heard lots and lots of those ideas. So anyway, you can amplify a little if you would on that, how that strikes you. I agree with your ideas of pressure strategies. You can comment more. My favorite one was almost unintended consequences of the invasion of Iraq, when Gaddafi in Libya suddenly got afraid, got concerned about what was happening. And Gaddafi actually said to Berlusconi, Silvio Berlusconi, the Italian leader at the time, and also the leader, he also said in an interview to Figaro, the French newspaper, that he thought he was next. The Americans will turn on him next. And so that helped to lead him out of the cold and to open up his arsenals for international inspection and actually to cooperate a lot on terrorism with the CIA. So he was in fact turned. And so that was a success. You might want to comment some more on those sorts of things. He also, I'd like to comment on how you would think of getting NATO and our Western allies to do more. We used to quit back in the 1980s, but when we had so-called collective security, the United States did the security and the Europeans did the collecting. But there was no, it was always America that did it. And it's gotten worse because the Europeans, as you all know, don't contribute their required 2% of GDPs to defense spending. Though some of the countries in Eastern Europe are beginning to get somewhat of a wake-up call because of the Russian activities. But you might, in fact, I'll be interested to hear what you think we can do to NATO. Finally, and then I'll stop, I want your observations on whether you think Obama is simply a blip on our screen, or this really could be a structural change in American foreign policy. Maybe not as extreme, but clearly he tapped into, and you mentioned this, a lot of disenchantment with the Iraq War, particularly in his first term, and then based his policies on that. And as you said clearly, those things went very well for him at first, and then of course topped it with the killing of Osama bin Laden. But things have not looked so great in Iraq today. Afghanistan, if you pick up any newspaper, it looks dismal. It's very, very serious. I mean, the security forces are clearly losing. And so that, but all of that will, of course, be water under the bridge because Obama will be out of office by a lot of times when the bell is really rung and the debt comes due on the crises that he's helped to contribute. But the next president will have to deal with these things, particularly in Afghanistan. Already will have to deal with something in the case of Iraq. So I'll stop there and look forward to your answers.
Okay. Great, thank you. So a few thoughts. Let me start with Carthaginian. That word was meant to apply to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So I talk about strategies of pressure, recommended strategies of pressure in the last chapter. The idea is we're facing some pretty aggressive authoritarian powers that look to expand their influence. In those cases, Iran, Russia, you need to counter pressure by bolstering deterrence. So that's not a Carthaginian strategy. That's a strategy that would be more robust than the one we're seeing now. It would push back. It would recognize, for example, that with Putin, we don't have to constantly only ask ourselves, what is Putin going to do to us? We actually have the ability to say, what are we going to do to Putin? I mean, we can push back. We have the ability to do that if we decide to. But it doesn't involve open warfare. In fact, I don't think Putin wants that any more than we do. So it would be a more robust form of peacetime competition with a country like Russia or China, right? Counter pressure. In relation to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, I believe in Carthaginian strategies, and I stand by that term. What I mean by that is that these groups must be destroyed. They can't simply be contained. ISIS, if you try to contain ISIS, you're allowing for a proto-state larger than England to plot terrorist attacks on innocent civilians in the West, which they are already doing, and it's unacceptable. This is not the Soviet Union. In some ways, it's worse. you could, as George Kennan said, you could contain the Soviet Union because they weren't deliberately suicidal. If you're dealing with suicide bombers, I don't think containment will work. You have to either kill or capture them before they attack you. You have to roll them back. The current strategy against ISIS is inadequate. It's very weak. It's half-hearted. It's not rolling back ISIS, just the opposite. So I'm not saying the United States has to do everything, but if we do so little, then why would, for example, Sunni Arabs in the region step up if they don't see the U.S. is going to step up? I mean, a lot of people all over the world watch to see if the U.S. is going to act and actually back up its words. If all they see is words and very, very detached action, they will watch that and they will accommodate the local power, or they will hide or run. So I think in some ways the U.S. needs to step up in order to get allies to step up, which is a little bit of the reverse of the Obama logic. So in the case of ISIS, we have to roll them back. And that Carthaginian in the sense of the destruction of ISIS has to be the goal. By the way, President Obama has said this. He just hasn't done it. He hasn't resourced the strategy. He's said that he believes in, eventually, the defeat of ISIS. But he doesn't act as though he does, right? There's all kinds of things we could be doing. Why can't U.S. Special Operations call in airstrikes against ISIS? I mean, it's just almost a zero-tolerance policy right now. So not Carthaginian in relation to major nation states, although I do think we have to push back in those cases, but Carthaginian in relation to jihadist terrorists that aim to kill innocent civilians in the West. Now, as far as the cost to taxpayers, if these strategies of counter-pressure are effective, if, for example, we push back a little bit more assertively against Russia, that wouldn't really have to cost the American taxpayer very much. In fact, in some cases, I think war would be less likely. Let me give you an example. In the East China Sea, the Japanese worry as to whether the U.S. will back up Japan against China. This is one of the conclusions that the Japanese have drawn in the Obama era. They've also drawn it by watching his behavior in other places like Ukraine and Syria. So that actually makes war more likely, right? This is how America's wars often begin. There's a misunderstanding about whether the U.S. is really committed. So I would suggest if it's crystal clear that we will defend Japan, that actually makes war between Japan and China less likely. So this does not necessarily involve open warfare. It's deterrence. We used to call this deterrence, right? It's a useful concept. We can still do it. One of the unfortunate things that Obama's done, and this is, I don't know if this is a blip or if this is a more long-term trend, he certainly responded to this broad sense by 2008 that the majority of the public was disillusioned with the war in Iraq and ready to scale back and certainly looking for a less assertive foreign policy. But he drew lessons from Iraq that were not entirely correct. You know, not every foreign policy crisis is another Iraq. Not every foreign policy crisis leads to a situation exactly like Iraq, but I think it's almost become a crippling lesson in the sense that he seems to have concluded that every single case should be handled as lightly as possible, as delicately as possible, as incrementally as possible. That is not necessarily the way to address these problems and to face down adversaries in a robust or convincing fashion. Sometimes it actually drags out the conflicts and makes them more likely. So in some ways he's drawn the wrong lessons from Iraq. And as have a lot of professors, by the way. This gets me in trouble on campus. But you know, there are some good lessons to draw from Iraq. I mean, I think that it's probably generally felt with the public. We don't necessarily want more Iraqs if what an Iraq means is 200,000 troops in a decade-long counterinsurgency with thousands of American casualties. I think the general public doesn't want another Iraq. I mean, that's fair enough. But we could push back a little more assertively without tremendous cost, either in American lives or financially, without having more Iraqs. We can do that in cases like Ukraine. We can do that in cases like the Iranian nuclear program. We can do that in cases like the China Seas. Back up our allies, counter pressure. Another example, why can't we arm the Ukrainian government against Russia? But most of the arguments that I hear have to do with not provoking Putin. You know, Putin invaded another country. It's a sovereign country. He dismantled it. And then the reaction is, well, we don't want to be too provocative. I mean, it's madness. This is the mentality. So I think that Obama, in some ways, I hope that it's a blip, because one of the conclusions that I've come to studying these issues over the years is the president makes a tremendous difference. Presidents can make foreign policy decisions, for better or worse, that have world historical consequences. We've seen that, right? And it wouldn't actually be impossible to imagine a president coming in 2017 who tweaks it a little bit, tries to get it right, and the fundamentals could be very similar. But I'm talking about not the fundamentals of the foreign policy, but the world could be similar. But if a president comes in determined to make it a priority to actually have a robust strategy, it's possible. It can be done. We've seen presidents of both parties do that over the lifetime of people in this room. So in that sense, I hope it's a blip, but a great deal does depend on the identity of the next president. Should I keep talking, or should we go to Q&A?
I think let's.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a few more things, or would you like to go into Q&A?
Let's have some Q&A.
Okay.
That would be great. Yeah.
All right. So if you just raise your hand and I'll point to you. Yes.
Thank you. There are so many questions in this, but I mean the big thing is, should we have withdrawn from Iraq on the timetable that we did and at the rate that we did?
No, I think it would have been worth the extra effort. I mean, if you read most solid accounts, so somebody like, is it Michael Gordon, Endgame? I can't remember if that was the co-author. There was a real issue of legal immunity, troop immunity, right? And that was, I'm not saying that there wasn't, but at the same time, it would have been worth the effort to try to close the deal and get those bases, because you see the results now. With no U.S. bases there, with no U.S. presence, it's that much easier for ISIS to roll over. And it was a very destabilizing thing, so it would have certainly been worth the effort. And if anything, it seems as though Iraqi leaders felt that the commitment from the White House was so weak. Why should they put their own political capital on the line if the president won't, if the American president won't? So I think it was definitely a mistake. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, just to enlarge on that question, it was a question I wanted to ask. Isn't staying in Iraq really just a supposition? I don't see any facts to back it up that it would have been beneficial. To look at it objectively, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq until the invasion. These people did not exist, and they arose after the invasion. And by 2012, it seemed to me that all of the Shia militias were against U.S. presence. The Sunni had no longer trusted and believed the Americans, and I believe if the Americans had any bases there, if they try to leave their bases, they would only feel resentment by the people and get pot shots taken out of them, including from ISIS, and I think the people even may have supported that. Now, that's also a supposition, but I don't think it's any more of a supposition than what you're saying. Do you have any concrete facts to prove what you say?
I just want to say one thing about your assertion that there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time. If you look back, and the source of this is Vali Nasser's book, Shiite Rising. If you look at the zone between Iraq and Syria in the 1980s, early 1990s, it was a hotbed of ferment, of ideological ferment through the region, all the way from down in Jordan, through that area. There were itinerant preachers. Their homilies were full of inflammatory polemical language. It was an enormous hotbed of activity. It was so bad that Saddam Hussein actually changed the Iraqi flag. You can look this up. You can find it on Google. He put in Arabic, Allah is great, on the flag. It had never been there before. He was a secular leader. And the reason he put that on there, he recognized the strength of this movement. He was afraid of it, as was Gaddafi. This thing was going to come. Had we invaded or not invaded, those movements were strong. They've been strong since at least 1979, with the overthrow of a Shah, with the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets, which triggered back. And finally, the Grand Mosque was also taken over in the same year. And at the same time, the American embassy was burned in Islamabad. That movement was not started by the Iraq War. It had very deep roots. So I just want to say that, but I'll let you answer the rest of the question.
Well, in a way, this goes to Kyron's point about indigenous factors, right? You don't have to deny that indigenous factors are real. You can say, for example, that the Iraqi government blew it by alienating Sunni Arabs, right? But you're making actually what we call a counterfactual, implicit counterfactual, which anybody has to make a judgment on this. You're suggesting, I guess, that if the U.S. had kept troops there, that the outcome would have been exactly the same. How do you know that that's true? The concrete facts that we have are the rise of ISIS. Those are the concrete facts. And we've got military experts and advisors for the last couple of years saying this didn't have to happen. It would have been at least worth the effort to keep some American troops on the ground, provide some backbone to Iraqi forces, and at least stave off the worst of it. So those are the facts. If you go in, as Obama often does, with an assumption that the U.S. is basically powerless to affect the outcome in these situations, it will be self-fulfilling. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I agree with you that there are a great deal of indigenous factors in these cases that are beyond America's power to control. It's true. But the U.S. has some ability, has some power to exercise whatever sticks and carrots it has. And if we go in with the assumption that we can't have any impact, then we certainly won't. You know? That's what happened in 2000.
Yes, I'll turn over here. Yes, sir. And I'll come back to you. Okay.
Thanks, Colin. It's a great book. For those of you who have not bought the book and have not read it, I highly recommend it. And, you know, one sign of a good book is that it raises more questions than answers. Two questions following the discussion here. First one, very short. Why Obama did not cut commitments? He decreased capabilities while maintaining the same commitments, as you put it. Why does he's not cutting commitments, rhetorically at least? So that's the first question. The second question has to do with this idea whether this is a blip or actually a trend that will be here for a while. You made an optimistic case that this is hopefully just a blip. Let me make a pessimistic case that this is not a blip for two reasons. And you can phrase it as a question later. The first reason is that he is appealing also to certain isolationist tendencies that cut across party lines. Right? I mean, there are Republicans or isolationists on the right side of the political spectrums that essentially agree on the outcomes of the Obama Doctrine, even if they do not necessarily agree on the motivations of it. You know, Rand Paul being a great example. So that there seem to be, this is just one example of many, that Obama is not just one guy, it's something that cuts across party lines. And the second reason why this may not be a blip is that this has been 8 years. 8 years is a long period of time, especially in this international relations, in an international environment. The damage done to our status as well as capabilities is quite large, and it will be very hard to undo both the reputational damage as well as the capabilities damage that the past 8 years have done. So it may be next president, even if he doesn't like this, he may have no choice but to say, look, it's a mess. Ukraine is a mess. Ukraine is gone. NATO is unresourced. The Middle East, God forbid we put troops in there. South China Sea is gone. So it becomes no longer a blip, but de facto a continuation.
Right. And
can I just add to that? Because I thought that was a thoughtful response to Tom's query about is this a blip? It would seem to me that it's not, because to suggest that it is suggests that President Obama is an island unto himself. He represents a deep strand of thinking in the American Academy and in the larger political sphere that's finding its way to the White House now. I think we are now seeing for the first time many of those who forged their ideas in the 60s and in the 70s and really back to the 50s and 40s, a kind of an alternative way of looking at American power that went against the kind of post-war state that developed. They're now in power. They have come of age. They run many think tanks in this city. They control a lot of resources. They're in the House and in the Senate. I think that it represents a deeper trend of what we will see in the White House, someone who looks at American exceptionalism very differently. But Colin, also your book suggests that the president has advisors who help him interpret his grand strategy. Their best work is interpreting it through a domestic lens. And so these are people who are relatively young and I think will be part of the political scene in the years ahead. I think we're facing a deeper American political contest about our role in the world, and it will not stop when Barack Obama leaves the Oval Office.
I agree with that. I mean, it's not a blip in the sense of it's not inconsequential. I mean, there's a fundamental. There was a realignment of the two parties after Vietnam. Democrats used to be about as hawkish as Republicans in the 50s, for example. After Vietnam, there was a new kind of post-Vietnam liberal, dovish, internationalist strain, which to some extent blamed the United States for what had gone wrong and said, as long as we rely on multilateral institutions, promote human rights, and don't use force, everything will be fine, because most of the problems are actually caused by us. So every Democrat since then has had to wrestle with that and sort of split the difference and at least gesture in that direction. Obama probably goes further than Clinton or Carter. I don't see Obama correcting himself as Carter did, for example, in 79, 80. So it's not a blip in that sense. This is very deep-rooted now, post-Vietnam liberalism, and he's representative of it. And one of the wonderful things about it, of course, is that he denies that there's any ideology at all. He would just say, I'm practical. He has a great line, by the way, in one of his autobiographies where he says, basically, I'm objective. I just happen to think the New York Times is right and the Wall Street Journal is wrong. So it's a great way of squaring the circle, which is you're objective, and the reason you're objective is because liberalism is just objectively right. So you don't have an opinion, right? It's not opinionated. It's not biased. So it's wonderful. Go read the passage. It's in one of his early memoirs. So in that sense, you have to be, I guess, a little bit pessimistic as Jakob is that there is a major presence in the country at the highest levels in our cultural intellectual elite, which buys these assumptions, and if anything, critiques him from the left. I mean, you're going to see criticisms of Hillary Clinton from some candidates. Probably all of the candidates running against her will critique her from the left, and they probably won't beat her, but that will be the criticism, that if anything, we need to scale back on drone strikes, right, and so on, be less hawkish than we've been. The left is very disappointed with Obama. They think he's been too hawkish. If he had actually been the president they wanted, he never would have been reelected. And that would have been impossible. He's at least that practical, right? He did know that he had to play to middle America at the end of the day. So I actually share a lot of the concerns that have been brought up. My only point specifically is for that very reason, because the parties were realigned, and this, by the way, is Rand Paul's problem. There was a Rand Paul. This is Rand Paul's problem. I think he's sincere, but Rand Paul is a dove in a hawkish party. And when the two parties realigned after Vietnam, hawks left the Democratic Party and migrated to the Republican Party. That was actually a strength for a long time for the Republican Party. It was viewed as clearly the stronger of the two parties on foreign policy and defense. And what that means to this day, so for example, Southern voters, right, they tend to be some of the most hawkish of Americans, the most supportive of the U.S. military. What that means today is any candidate running for the Republican nomination is running in a party that is fundamentally hawkish or hardline on foreign policy. I actually think that's fine because I would like to see a Republican president who's more hawkish than Obama. Not to the point of overkill, but somebody who kind of bolsters U.S. defenses and bolsters those deterrent lines in relation to some of the competitors we talked about. And in that sense, I am optimistic because I think it's entirely possible that you could have, we've seen several candidates right now running who could run and win the nomination and the presidency on a platform like that. That's the specific. I'm not suggesting that Obama's policies won't have some lasting effect, but I do think that it's possible to push back.
Okay. Yeah. I have a couple of questions here that I have to get to. I just want to do a quick two-finger. You do say in the book that the Republican Party has still a large reservoir of hawks in the party.
Yeah.
But couldn't someone like Rand Paul help realign the Republican Party? You seem to accept in the book that this is the way it is for Republicans. But maybe we're beginning to see, a kind of body snatching between the parties where the Republican Party is no longer going to be the dominant hawkish party on national security. It might be more of a hybrid. I just want to throw that out there. While you think about that, I'd like to go on to the woman sitting in the front. I can't read your name tag.
I should mention that I'm a former Hoover Fellow a long time ago. My name is Juliana Pilan, and I would like to say that it would be useful if people did introduce themselves.
Okay. Yes.
Fascinating conversation. in light of the last points that you all made, and Tom first brought it up with the idea of the academy, the political culture, the ideas in this country that have so changed in the past few decades. What I find curious is that among your recommendations, Colin, you don't also emphasize the war of ideas element, the soft power element. Admittedly, the concept of soft power is about as lame as one can possibly imagine, and Joseph Nye has done us all such a disservice. Soft power for softies. But in reality, what the military has done exceptionally well in both Iraq and Afghanistan. It was the afterward, the so-called stabilization and reconstruction part, where we lost billions. And there are books out there, and there's the report of the Iraq and Bowen's report on Iraq reconstruction that show what tremendous mistakes we made, not only wasting money, but actually empowering the wrong people and so on, billions. There is not enough conversation about how America can be and should be smarter. And smart power is also not what I'm talking about. But there is no appetite among Republicans any more than Democrats for just putting more money into hardware. Do you also, in your book, and I have yet to read it, talk about how we can have a more robust war of ideas, for lack of a better term? The Broadcasting Board of Governors is a poor excuse for whatever it is we do by way of communication, and that's it. Sorry, long question.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason in principle that conservatives or Republicans have to avoid the concept of soft power, right? I mean, as you can think of, there's lots of ways you could think about it. Actually, President Bush, to his credit, I think a lot of people admire what he did on foreign aid, Millennium Challenge and malaria and AIDS. But so the war of ideas, though, I just would want to be a little bit careful because it's not as though we haven't tried. I mean, we've tried public diplomacy in the Muslim world, and we're not very good at it. This has been several years now where people have tried all kinds of different ideas and different techniques and sort of let's treat it as soap that we're selling, and it hasn't worked very well. It would certainly be worth trying to come up with a better approach if it's possible. But I think that without dismissing the concept of soft power, I would just say, you know, hard power carries a weight of its own. If you want reputation, sometimes you might actually need to demonstrate some capability on the ground. If it's just a matter of broadcasting on Facebook, I think that the people fighting ISIS are going to say, what are they actually doing here to protect us, right? If you, counterinsurgency, for example, one of the things in counterinsurgency that really matters is villagers, for example, have to believe that they're safe at night from insurgents. So it's not simply a matter of public diplomacy, it's a matter of protection, security. That's going to involve some people on the ground. It's not necessarily always popular, but there are a lot of people who are very intimidated by ISIS who are going to be reluctant to pop their head up until they can see the U.S. is doing something on the ground. So I do think that the war of ideas and soft power, there's a great history of this. The Cold War, the U.S. was much more successful. It's an interesting thought. Why hasn't it been more successful in the war on terror, right? But I don't think there is no silver bullet. That's really what I want to say. There is no silver bullet called public diplomacy or soft power, which is going to allow us to escape costs of a strategy against ISIS that's actually going to work.
Yeah. There's other questions. Did you have one? And then I'm going to move around the room. Okay. Oh, Mike, yes.
First of all, this makes me really happy to be with Hoover, this whole discussion. Terrific. I want to ask a question, Colin, on the concept of trust. So you mentioned that there's a gap between the kind of commitments we make on the one hand and the capacities we have to meet those commitments on the other internationally. That a lot of countries, a lot of leaders in other countries are suspect of our ability to deliver. Maybe there's a lack of trust there. domestically and on Capitol Hill, there are the trust factor relative to President Obama is pervasive in almost every policy issue that emerges. And one example recently is the Trade Promotion Authority debate. A lot of otherwise free market and pro-free trade Republicans don't want to support something they've supported in the past because they don't trust the way the president might use that authority. So I guess the question is, both domestically and internationally, what impact has this erosion of trust had on the whole President Obama's ability to carry out his agenda?
I think it's been tremendous. I mean, if you repeatedly do not do what you say you're going to do, people will eventually notice. It's just that simple. I mean, it's actually not that complicated. Scholars develop all kinds of theories as to why this doesn't matter. It matters. There are university press books saying that, for example, the Japanese shouldn't be paying attention to what's going on in Ukraine because it's on the other side of the world. As it turns out, they're paying attention, right? When you draw a red line in Syria and don't enforce it, if David Letterman makes a joke of it on TV that night, that has got to the level where anybody and everybody can see there's a problem. It's just a lack of credibility. It's trust. You're not doing what you said you would do. The same thing with delivering. There was another story this morning about delivering aid to the rebels in Syria. We've been hearing this for years. 4 years, I think, we've been hearing commitments to aid to the rebels. Now, whatever you think about that policy, the president has repeatedly said he's going to do it, and it is happening, and then it hasn't happened. So at a certain point, people will wise up, and they'll say, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. We're dealing with somebody who says one thing and does something else. And that is very dangerous in international politics. It's very dangerous because you're going to get salami slicing tactics by actors like the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. The Iranians aren't particularly afraid of him. Why should they be? You know, he's demonstrated that he's extremely reluctant to use force. So I think it's a serious problem. And on the domestic side, actually, the issue of trust in Congress has been very important. To get back to Kyron's point, there are certainly factions in the Republican Party today that are not hawkish. But in a way, it's been misread because there's a large number of Republicans, I think, today who instinctively are kind of American national security hawks, but they don't trust President Obama. So if the effort is led by him in his characteristic way, they will often respond by saying, well, I know I don't like jihadists, but I really don't like the way this president's handling it. So I'm not enthusiastic about his intervention, right? Whichever case. It's exactly what happened in Syria. I mean, even now, you're seeing. I think TPP is a great example. Republicans philosophically are for free trade, right? But I mean, some just hate the thought of granting more authority to this president because they don't trust him. So that's actually another reason I'm hopeful, is because I think if you did have a kind of Republican internationalist president, there would be a switch. And a lot of that instinctive support for more robust policies would come forward again because you wouldn't have a president like Obama. Now, the flip side is, I have to say, probably a lot of liberal Democrats in Congress would go the other way. That would be the other thing to watch for.
Yeah. There's some hands over here. Yes, and do state your name.
Hi, I'm Kyle Sawyer. You mentioned Carthaginian tactics and using them against insurgent groups. And I was wondering if you could point to past successful uses of Carthaginian tactics against insurgent groups, particularly maybe, I know China has had problem with the Uyghurs and Russia has had problems with the Chechens, and they've used pretty harsh tactics, and yet it's still an issue in both the second and third largest military powers in the world. And correct me if I'm wrong on that. So, and then what tactics would you suggest future presidents use to pursue this Carthaginian strategy against insurgent groups?
So in the case of Russia, for example, if you're talking about basically deliberately targeting cities, that's not what I'm recommending. I don't think that's American. That's not, the Americans don't consider that moral or right, and it's not going to happen. So I wouldn't recommend that. What I would recommend, I mean, actually in some ways Obama's done some of it with Al-Qaeda Central. He did actually take Al-Qaeda Central seriously. He didn't take the affiliates as seriously, but I think he came in with a genuine belief that you had to hammer away at Al-Qaeda Central using a combination of special operations, drone strikes, intelligence, initially the Afghan surge, and actually we wore them down. That was a kind of mini Carthaginian strategy, and bin Laden was killed in 2011. So he himself has been able to do this. He can be pretty ruthless when he wants to be. What I would suggest is that in a case like ISIS, we're going to have to do something more aggressive. we're going to have to actually roll them back and not just contain them. Specifically, I would say you might need more Americans on the ground. You might need to allow them to enter into combat. You might need them to call in airstrikes. I'm not saying you need 200,000 people patrolling the streets getting shot at, but special operations, support, air power. I mean, the level of, for example, we're currently saying that for an airstrike to be authorized, there has to be a risk of civilian casualties equal to 0. Now, that's admirable morally. Would we have been able to liberate France from Adolf Hitler if we had said that our Air Force could not implement any attacks with any civilian casualties? I mean, we're not Russia. We're not going to destroy Iraq the way the Russians destroyed Chechnya. But can we fight with some seriousness? That's what I'm recommending.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, Emily Bernstein-Messner here at Hoover. And I just wanted to follow up on something you talked about earlier about Iran, saying that Obama's presence is, who knows, Iran might change. And of course, Obama says that the Iran deal is not dependent upon Iran changing, and that it's also the best option even if Iran doesn't change, because we reserve our capabilities. We reserve the right to use overwhelming force. And you've talked about how nobody really believes that Obama would use overwhelming force. So this leads into a sort of greater problem of American foreign policy, which is that with changing every 4 to 8 years, with changing leadership every 4 to 8 years, and with the fact that even under that leadership, oftentimes Congress is not on the same page as the president, how can U.S. foreign policy more generally be sort of trusted to live up to its commitments that it's made in the past, and also to actually live up to its threats that it's made in the past as well?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there are, and obviously foreign allies and adversaries watch. They watch the elections. They're very curious. They know that the president might change 4 years later, and they're very aware that the policy might change. There's no getting around it. I mean, we're living in a democracy where we have presidential elections, and that's how we like it. But what I think a president can do within the time that they're there is to impose some greater coherence over their strategy, and it's not humanly impossible. You know, Reagan did it. Frankly, Nixon did it. Truman did it. Eisenhower did it. We've had a number of presidents that did it, whether you like them personally or not, whether you like their politics or not. So we've had a bipartisan problem now since the end of the Cold War. It has to be said, which is there's been some lack of coherence, right, in American foreign policy strategy, and that might be for large reasons, which is we've no longer got the great enemy of the Soviet Union. It looked as though for a moment after 9/11 that Bush had located this concept of a war on terror. But in the initial invasion of Iraq, the way that was handled, back to the point about soft power and coordinating different departments and agencies, it was not well coordinated. I mean, this is clear, right? Whatever you think about the initial invasion. However, to his credit, Bush actually implemented a surge, 2007, very unpopular, which did bring all those elements into coordination, and it really did quite well. I think support for it was under 20% when he did it. He ignored the polls, and he did it because he wanted to get the policy right. So in that sense, he made major mistakes earlier, but that surge review was in some ways a model of how to do it. If he had, for example, done the opposite, if he had just withdrawn, we would all be talking, political scientists would be talking about how it was inevitable that the U.S. withdrew, structurally inevitable, right? That's called leadership. That's what a leader does. It's possible. And so I think but if you have somebody at the top, there is no substitute for that. If the president will not pay sustained attention and impose some order on the foreign policy strategy and make sure that it's implemented in a serious way, connecting ends to means and words to actions, nobody else can or will. That's how our system works. It's a presidential system. The Secretary of State can't do it. The National Security Advisor can't do it. There's nobody else in that position. And that's what we're seeing today. It's drift, really.
We're going to take one last question. And since you've asked a question before, do tell us your name.
Yes, I will, yeah. My name is Luke Phillips. I'm working over at the American Interest magazine. Now, tomorrow I'll be going to an event with Senator Tom Cotton, and he's going to be giving a foreign policy speech. And as you know, he wrote the infamous letter to the Ayatollahs, telling them that if the Republicans gain control of the White House, then they won't acknowledge any deal that Obama signs. And part of that is in response, of course, to Obama being very, very centralized about his foreign policy and not even talking with Republicans in Congress about what to do. But at the same time, that also presents a really worrying American face to the world, saying we're very divided at home. So I want to know what you think morally and what you think strategically about Tom Cotton and the Republicans who signed that. Were they heroes? Were they villains? Is it all Obama's fault? How do we make any sense of this issue, and how should we move forward out of it?
Well, apart from that letter, I mean, generally I think it's legitimate for Congress to assert itself on something this serious, and actually members of both parties have. And Senator Corker made an effort, which had broad bipartisan support, to say we're not going to be voiceless on this, right? You have a very fateful negotiation with a possible nuclear weapons power that is bitterly hostile to the United States. So Congress has a right to weigh in. If the president is going to claim that it's simply under his executive authority, Congress is going to push back. So this is a two-way street. It isn't simply that Conant was writing out of nothing. The context was that the president has been asserting his authority to do this, not as a treaty, right? The White House's position was, we don't actually need Congress's approval at all. So if that's what the president's saying, you would expect Congress to push back. Now, the exact way that they did, right, we can debate, was it right or wrong, but I think it's quite appropriate that Congress would push back, because members of both parties are saying this is a major concession. What we're seeing in the outlines of a deal is really quite disturbing, and the idea that the president's own position, the United Nations' own position, a couple of years ago was that there would be a grand bargain, right, whereby Iran would give up its nuclear weapons capacity. Well, it's doing no such thing. That Iran would accept full inspections. We've heard the Supreme Leader now say, no. He's been very clear. By the way, this is a useful thing I recommend in general. If you're looking at a foreign government that says, we think of you as an enemy, take it seriously. I would take that seriously. If the Supreme Leader of Iran says, we are not allowing in inspectors, maybe he actually means it, all right? Now, that's a core condition of this negotiation. It can't just be easily dismissed. Oh, well, that's something he said. Maybe he said it for domestic purposes. How is this deal supposed to work? So of course Congress is asserting itself. Democrats are asserting themselves in Congress too. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that I think it's appropriate to have oversight in a case like this. If it's not going to be a treaty with 2/3 approval from the Senate, at least there's got to be some congressional involvement.
Well, we could go on, and in fact, we'll spill over into the next room and have more wine and beer and whatever exists there if the director says we can stay in the building a little bit longer. But I would like to thank the panel and thank Colin for this excellent book.
Very good.
And you're well on your way to catching Tom Henriksen in book writing. And I'd like to thank Paige and Matt and the Hoover team here, the photographer and the technician. All of you help make these activities happen, and you're part of the Hoover family. And I'd like to also suggest that you buy the book, which we have here, and get an autographed copy. I don't know, are we giving the book away, or what are we doing?
Not that I know of.
Oh, you may purchase the book, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good.
Before you drift, I brought this for you. Remember we talked about this?
Okay.
Call me about that. You would be still eligible for that fellowship, and Chiron and I would back you. It doesn't mean you'll get it.
Yeah.
We have to fight for it, but keep it in mind. And if you want details, just let me know. It's a year-long fellowship.
You stay for a while so we can talk?
And Hoover pays, and they pay for families and so on.
I'm glad
you come out there. So keep it in mind, you're young enough, you're an associate professor, and you'd be a good candidate. So, yeah, we'll keep...
The webcast.
Yeah, well, they
video, and we
not
will
exactly.
convert it and put it up on the website.
September 11th, June, July, nobody's going to say anything.
tape.
So we'll put the tape on. It'll probably be early next week. Okay. But I'll let
Great,
you
I
know.
appreciate it. Yeah, this was
Keep in mind, that's how I was
We have an
a
event
felon.
page for it, so it'll
Some
go
of, Ben Bernanke
Sorry.